An address taped by British historian David Irving concerns one of the most amazing attempts at thought control this century. The attempt to prevent David Irving from visiting and lecturing in Australia, following a similar ban in Canada, raises grave questions for the supporters of freedom everywhere. Why is there an internationally orchestrated campaign against David Irving at this time? This has never happened before. A prodigious writer, Irving has had over 20 major historical works to his credit, starting with his bestseller, The Destruction of Dresden, in 1963. Irving's works have been published by prestigious publishing houses such as Macmillan, William Collins, Simon & Schuster, Hodder & Stoughton, and Michael Joseph. While some of his works have been described as controversial, his works generally have been favourably reviewed. His major work, Hitler's War, will be found in most university libraries around the world and in military academies. Well-known British historian A.J.P. Taylor, best known for his Origins of the Second World War, has described Irving as a patient researcher of unrivalled industry and success, while major establishment historian Hugh Trevor Roper has said that no praise can be too high for Irving's indefatigable scholarly industry. A master of research in the field of original documents, Irving was the man who publicly, at the famous press conference in Hamburg on April 25, 1983, at the launching of the alleged Hitler diaries, exposed them as a forgery and a hoax. Based on the assurance of Hugh Trevor Roper, the Murdoch press had paid an enormous sum for the alleged diaries, which they had commenced to serialise. David Irving visited Australia in 1986 for a lecture tour associated with the publication, by Veritas Publishing, of the paperback edition of Uprising, his work on the Hungarian anti-communist revolution of 1956. This had first been published in 1981 in the United Kingdom by the well-known publishing house of Hodder & Stoughton Limited. The following year, 1987, Irving returned to Australia for the launch of Churchill's War, also published by Veritas. During both the 1986 and 87 Australian tours by Irving, there was no suggestion that the British historian, by his presence, had threatened any civil disorders or violated any Australian laws. Irving had also conducted several Canadian lecture tours without any problems, except some protests organised by Zionist activists. David Irving was scheduled to commence a lecture of Australia on March 17, 1993, coming direct from South Africa, where he was finalising his latest major work, Goebbels' Diaries, which was commissioned by Macmillan. However, yielding to an intense Zionist Jewish campaign, which blatantly demanded that Irving not be allowed to visit Australia, the then Australian Immigration Minister, Mr. Jerry Hand, after some delay, ruled that Irving be denied a visa to enter Australia. Prior to Irving being informed of the decision, the Zionist newspaper, the Australian Jewish News, had already claimed that Hand had assured Zionist lobbyists that Irving was being denied a visa. This was a clear breach of confidentiality concerning Australian visa applications. Leading libertarians, including some unsympathetic to what they believed to be Irving's views, were shocked by what they saw as an unprecedented violation of freedom of speech in Australia. While stressing that he was no supporter of David Irving's views, the President of the Queensland Council of Civil Liberties, Mr. Terry O'Gorman, called for the immediate overturning of the ban, describing it as obnoxious and the equivalent of a banning of free speech in a section of the Australian community. A number of academics expressed their disquiet about the Irving ban. Typical of the protests was that of Professor J. Gregory, former Professor of Geography at the University of Melbourne, who said that he was writing in defence of the honourable principles of free speech, which he said was the basis of the Australian democratic system. Mr. John Bennett, President of the Australian Civil Liberties Union and author of the well-known annual publication Your Rights, commenting on the claim that David Irving's presence in Australia might be disruptive, pointed out that he himself chaired 2 well-advertised and well-attended public meetings for Irving during his previous visits to Australia, and there was not even one interjection. There was no incitement to racial violence. He felt that Irving's views on the Holocaust should be publicly discussed. A major and encouraging feature of all this was the unanimous attitude of the daily press of Australia, which said the ban should be removed. The Melbourne Age said the federal government's decision not to allow the controversial British historian to revisit Australia is understandable, but it is neither courageous nor right. The government was under strong pressure from the Jewish community to exclude him, but the reasons given fall short of convincing. To deny entry to David Irving suggests a national immaturity in tolerating the expression of unpopular opinions and reeks of political poltroonery by a government unwilling to risk votes. The Brisbane Courier Mail stated that David Irving had an inalienable right to state his case, and any Australians who wish to have an equal right to hear him state it. One of the most forthright editorials opposing the Irving ban was that of the Herald Sun in Melbourne, which said that the ban was an assault on free speech which should be reversed, commenting, "The ban makes a nonsense of the government's censorious hectoring of other countries for the denial of human rights, including the right of free speech. By refusing Mr. Irving entry, the government is indulging in the sort of behaviour it claims to find so abhorrent in others." Obviously stung by this type of press editorial comment, Foreign Affairs Minister Senator Gareth Evans, who has prided himself on his libertarian philosophy, desperately sought to justify the ban by citing what he described as the particular volatility that exists in the community at election times. Presumably, the Foreign Minister overlooked the fact that David Irving's tour was scheduled to start after the elections held on March 13th, and not before. One of the most disturbing features of this extraordinary affair was that of some politicians, the Australian Democrat senators were amongst the first to demand that Irving be banned, while following the ban, the Liberal National Party opposition, through its then Shadow Minister of Immigration, Mr. Philip Ruddock, endorsed what the Labor government had done. All this raises the question of who is running Australia? Well-known and respected columnist for the Weekend Australian, Humphrey McQueen, was one of the more courageous journalists who attempted to answer this question, bluntly stating in his column of February 20th, 21st, that the ban is political in the meanest sense, because even without the election, the Labor Party is terrified of losing votes and donations from the local Zionists. Presumably, the other parties are also terrified for the same reasons. Not surprisingly, allegations like these, together with the widespread publicity about the Irving affair, started to create some unease among the relatively small Australian Jewish community. There were suggestions that Zionist leaders, like Mr. Izzy Liebler, had gone too far. Prominent Melbourne Jewish leader, Mr. Peter Isaacson, came out in his own journal, the suburban Malvern Southern Cross, stating that he did not agree with his fellow co-religionists who sought the Irving ban, and that the Minister for Immigration would have served both democracy and the Australian Jewish community better if he had allowed David Irving to visit Australia. He urged that the new minister reverse the Hand decision so that Irving's preposterous propositions can be demolished. Irving agrees with this attitude and seeks to have his views and findings tested by rational debate. The widespread publicity concerning the Irving ban eventually forced Zionist leaders to change their tactics, claiming that as Irving's books sold freely, the question of freedom of speech did not arise. It was claimed that Irving was a threat because he was a rabble-rousing leader of a growing international neo-Nazi movement. But as David Irving points out, there are no books of his on the Holocaust selling because he has written no such books. And he challenges the Izzy Lieblers to produce any evidence that he is a neo-Nazi, a racist, or engaged in rabble-rousing. The Zionists' careless handling of the truth and the manner in which many journalists who admit they've not read one word of Irving's books repeat what in many cases is blatant lying leaves unanswered the question of why there is an orchestrated international campaign against David Irving. Have his researchers taken him too close to some explosive revelations which the Zionist Jews fear being discussed? In this recording, you can hear and see what David Irving is really saying, and then make up your own mind.
Ladies and gentlemen, I suppose it's an irony that the more they try to silence you and stop you from speaking in public, the more the public becomes aware of you and of the message that you're trying to put across. Our enemies, our traditional enemies, you all know who they are. In this respect, we've overestimated them. I think we've all been concerned about the level of their intelligence and the breadth of their connections and the networks that they control worldwide. And yet surely if they had wanted to ensure that the legend that they've been spreading for 50 years, this historical legend, this blood lie on the German people, if they'd wanted to ensure that this legend survived, they would have done everything they could to see that I was ignored. Instead of which, by the methods that they've adopted, not just in Australia, but previously in Canada, and before that in Argentina, and before that in Germany and England, around the world, the methods that they've adopted have succeeded, in fact, in attracting international attention to the whole controversy, the whole debate. In the latter part of this talk, I'm going to go into detail about what the debate is about. But first of all, I thought I'd look at the controversy. I'd look at the methods that have been used in an attempt to silence me, some of which are pretty ugly, some of which are, I think, reminiscent of the Nazis. These are methods that are being used now by people in the late 1990s, and yet you might imagine you were back in the 1930s, that you were living in the era of Mussolini and the spoonful of castor oil, or the concentration camp, or the fascist methods, the methods of the Nazis. If I tell you that 6 months ago, organized gangs of people were going around the leading bookshop chains in the Midlands of Britain, smashing the plate glass windows of bookstores like Waterstones or Dillon's or W.H. Smith's, and then writing letters to them next day on the stationery of the local Jewish organization saying, we're terribly sorry that your windows got smashed. It's probably because of the book by David Irving that you're stocking, and we recommend you stop stocking that book, and then probably your windows won't get smashed anymore. Letters had obviously been drafted by lawyers, because there's no way that the police can have the organizations themselves. I only know about this campaign that went on in Britain last summer because the local newspapers, the provincial newspapers, Norwich, Nottingham, Newcastle, reported this, not the national newspapers, you notice. It's a telling comment on the cowardice of the national press, that in many matters of great national importance, they show less courage than the provincial editors do. Window smashing. Not just window smashing, but book burning. In southern England, there's a bookshop chain called Volume 1. The Volume 1 bookshops in Southampton and Portsmouth and Southsea, all the way along the southern coast of England, they were subjected to visits by the same gangs, the same thugs. And in one bookshop, the manager was actually required to take my bookshop off his shelves and burn them. Now, what is book burning about, for God's sake? Book burning. It's like the Nazis. It's like 1933 all over again. They're using the methods of the Nazis in order to try to preserve their own legends. Now, I'm not so arrogant as to say, thou shalt have no other truth, thou shalt have no other version of history but mine. It's quite possible that in the version of history that I tell you about later on in this talk, I'm wrong. I'm not going to say that what I say, what I found in the archives, my interpretation of history is 100% pure gold, 22 carat, and that there is no flaw in it. However, if freedom of speech means anything at all, it means the right to express opinions that may prove wrong. It means, freedom of speech means the right to be wrong, in fact. And this is an important right, I think, and it's a right which I feel very strongly about. I've got no particular axe to grind about the Nazis or about Winston Churchill or about the Holocaust or about the Jews or about Poland or about any of the other great controversies, Pearl Harbor, the World War II. I've got no axe to grind. The only axe I've got to grind as a historian is my total commitment to the truth as I interpret it and as I find it in the archives. It may be that I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, of course, I regret it. But the great delight, the relish that one has as a controversial historian, somebody who every morning, I suppose, is going over the top again, fighting some fresh battle. The relish that I find is the knowledge that I am very seldom proved wrong. Usually, I am proved right. Sometimes the case remains open. Adolf Hitler, the diaries of Adolf Hitler, the Goebbels diaries, the death of General Sikorsky in that mysterious plane crash in July 1943. All these historical controversies, sometimes you never really can draw a line underneath it and say that is what actually happened. In fact, the more that the years pass, we're now 50 years nearly from the end of World War II, the more difficult it becomes. Not the easier, but the more difficult it becomes to establish what really happened. So some files have to remain open. And it's our great ambition as historians, really, to find a particular file and close it and say, that's what happened. Now we found the final verse. Now we found the final truth. For example, one great historical controversy, the Reichstag fire. In February 1933, when the German Parliament building mysteriously burned to the ground at 9 o'clock one evening, and it enabled Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to round up all the communists and lock them all away in concentration camps, and it, in effect, was the first step of Adolf Hitler towards the road to absolute power, the Reichstag fire. All the communists, all the Jewish organizations, the newspapers around the world said, obviously, it was a Nazi setup, a Nazi stunt in order to enable them to take that first step, the Reichstag fire. Obviously, it was the SA, the brown shirts, who set fire to the Reichstag building. And for 50 years and more, that controversy has raged back and forth around the historical corridors of universities between historians and publicists and journalists and lawyers and the courtrooms, and people have been hanged for it. Nobody really knew what happened in the Reichstag building on that February evening in 1933 until I went to Moscow last July. And there in Moscow I found 1,600 glass slides, the microfiche, containing the original handwritten diaries, 50 pages per page, microfilmed on these primitive glass slides, of the Nazi propaganda minister, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, who was actually with Adolf Hitler that evening in February 1933. And he writes how the telephone rings at 9 o'clock that evening and a phone call comes to say that the Reichstag, the Parliament building's on fire in Berlin. And the two of them, Hitler and Goebbels, are deeply shocked, and they jump in their car and they drive across Berlin. They're very astonished to see the building on fire. And this is the private diary of the Nazi propaganda minister, Dr. Goebbels. He was appointed minister a few days later. Nobody had seen this page before I set eyes on it in Moscow in July last year. So I had the great pleasure of being able to close a file, the file on the Reichstag fire. And the same kind of historical evidence enabled me to close another file, I have to say rather shamefacedly, one where I was wrong, or appeared to be wrong. The Night of Broken Glass in November 1938. You remember that's when Adolf Hitler was in Munich, and as a reprisal for the Jewish assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, the Nazis went out onto the streets and committed outrages against Jews and against Jewish property. About 100 synagogues were burned to the ground, about 60 Jews were killed that night. A huge number of Jewish businesses and shops were burned to the ground or looted or smashed to pieces. The Night of Broken Glass is gone in history. And from Hitler's private staff, who I interviewed a few years later, I built up a very firm picture that Hitler was in the dark that night about what happened, and that he was very angry, and that he sent his staff out into the streets of Munich, ordering them to protect Jewish businesses. On Goebbels' diaries, on those Moscow microfiche, I found for the first time the 4 or 5 handwritten pages, close pages of his almost illegible handwriting, describing how he was with Hitler that night. And here he describes how Hitler thoroughly endorses what he, Goebbels, has done, namely starting that outrage that night. This was a deep shock for me, and I immediately announced it to the world's newspapers that I had discovered this material, although it appeared to go against what I'd written in my own book, Hitler's War. But even there you have to add a rider and say, wait a minute, this is Dr. Goebbels writing this. Dr. Goebbels who took all the blame for what was done. So did he have perhaps a motive for writing in his private diaries subsequently that Adolf Hitler endorsed what he had done? You can't entirely close that file. So some of the great historical mysteries remain open, others remain closed. But you have no axe to grind. On the Holocaust, on the gas chambers, on Auschwitz, on these great issues of Jewish history, we independent historians, shall we say, the non-Jewish historians, the ones with an entirely open mind, we've got no real axe to grind, although they try to make out that it's some kind of anti-Semitic crusade for us. It isn't. If somebody came along to me tomorrow, or if in the archives in Moscow last July, I had found a document signed Adolf Hitler saying, I order herewith that 6 million Jews should be put to death in gas chambers in the concentration camp known as Auschwitz, then I would not have been sorry. I would say, well, it's been an interesting debate, we've had an interesting controversy for the last 10 years about this, and here's the document that proves my theory was wrong, now I can close the file. Because you see, it's nothing to me. I'm not earning huge sums of money from one version of history or the other. But for my opponents, precisely that is what is the obstacle. Because the Holocaust, with a capital H, is what has gone down in history in this one-sentence form, so to speak. Adolf Hitler ordered the killing of 6 million Jews in Auschwitz. And because of that, the Israeli government has received from the German government, in compensation, about $4 billion a year, together with the payments made by the American taxpayers. And this is the contribution on which the state of Israel depends. So it's a matter of vital urgency that this Holocaust statement, I won't call it legend, I won't call it truth, I just say it's a statement. It's a matter of vital urgency that that statement should remain intact. So if you wonder why around the world the most extraordinary methods are being used to try and silence me, well, not just me, but other people who are beginning to question that statement, not every detail about it, but just some elements of the statement, some elements of the Holocaust package. The answer is we are being attacked because we are infringing on somebody else's big business. As the chief rabbi of England, Lord Jakobowitz, said only a couple of years ago, the Holocaust has become big business worldwide. He deplored it. It's become big business, he said, for the film stars, for the movie makers, for the directors, the producers, the television organizations, the publishers around the world. They are all doing what I said, perhaps less tastefully, in a reader's letter in an Australian newspaper. I said the Jewish people have dined out on the Holocaust for the last 50 years. And you may think that's a tasteless remark, and if people are offended by it, then I apologize. But unfortunately, the methods that are being used against us are not just tasteless. They are brutal, they are criminal, they are, in many ways, worse than the Nazis themselves adopted in the suppression of free speech. Now, it would be wrong of me to suggest that I alone am conducting this fight. I'm not so arrogant or selfish to maintain that I'm the only person who has gone over the top in this particular historical debate. Later on in the talk, I'll be mentioning the names of some of the real heroes who've been fighting this particular campaign. What does surprise me is that our opponents have decided to use the wrong tactics in order to try and win the debate. Surely the correct procedure, if they had any confidence in the strength of their case, be it Winston Churchill's role in World War II, or the truth about Pearl Harbor, or the truth about the Holocaust, surely the correct thing would have been to have accepted our invitation to open forum debates. They would put up their best men. I would put up myself or any one of a number of other historians who are coming around to our revisionist point of view, and then the free public could decide after a free and open debate which of us had the stronger case. This is precisely what our opponents are anxious to avoid. They are trying to stifle a debate. They say there is no debate. They say the Holocaust is not negotiable. They say they are not going to meet on the same platform as Mr. Irving. Around the world, in fact, television producers who have invited me to appear in their programs have then subsequently had to telephone to say, Mr. Irving, we're terribly sorry, we're going to have to cancel the invitation. For example, in Berlin on October the 3rd, 1989, I was invited to appear in a television program by Senderfreies Berlin. And a few days later, the producer of the program telephoned me to say he was terribly sorry, but the other historians on the panel had unanimously refused to sit around a table with myself. Dr. Eberhard Jekyll Professor Eberhard Jekyll, in fact, the head of the history department of the University of Stuttgart. Now, you would think that in that kind of position, this would be a historian who would be open to new ideas, who would be open to new documentary evidence, new challenges, and who was sufficiently confident of his own case to be able to debate in front of millions of television viewers. And yet he is frightened. They are such cowards that they refuse to debate with me. I might mention that Professor Eberhard Jekyll, the head of the history department at the University of Stuttgart, actually recently published on a television program in Germany a photograph which he claimed showed a trainload of Jews being shipped off to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. It subsequently turned out that these weren't Jews at all. They were the citizens of Hamburg going on a shopping expedition to the Ruhr, and that the photograph was taken in 1946, 1 year after the war was over. So he's not just a liar and a coward, but also a falsifier, a counterfeiter of historical evidence as well. Professor Eberhard Jekyll of the University of Stuttgart. When the Senderfreies Berlin in 1989 uninvited me from that program, I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, because I've bought the air ticket already and I've booked my hotel room at the Hotel Kempinski. I'm going to be in Berlin on October the 3rd, 1989. And the producer, Dr. Ott, he was very apprehensive, and he said, Mr. Irving, you don't understand. We're not inviting you anymore because the other historians have refused to be at the same table with you. And I said, Dr. Ott, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to be inside the studio that evening. I'm going to be outside the studio with my friends. And we staged a demonstration in Berlin. My friends and I, about 100, 150 of us, outside the studio of Senderfreies Berlin with placards marching up and down outside the studio, placards reading, German historians are liars and cowards. And that basically is what I still think of them today. They're liars and cowards. They know what the truth is, but they're frightened to speak it. I can give just one example of it. The head of the University of Freiburg history department, Dr. Bernd Martin, Professor Bernd Martin now, a very good friend of mine for 20 years. You know the way historians are. We write each other letters, we give each other tips. He writes me a letter saying, could I have the diary of Dr. Havel, and so on. And we help each other. And I visited him in September 1989, and I had a bottle of wine with him one evening. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he said, you know, Irving, I think you're a bit wrong about Auschwitz. I've been to Auschwitz, not like you, he said. I've been to Auschwitz. I know the director of the Auschwitz State Museum, Dr. František Pieper. Dr. František Pieper is a reputable historian. He's a Jewish historian, one of the leading historians on the Auschwitz tragedy. And Pieper told Martin, according to what Martin told me, that the gas chamber they showed to the tourists in Auschwitz is in fact a fake, built after the war by the Poles. I was astonished when Martin told me this, the head of the history department in Freiburg in Germany, admitting that he knew that the gas chamber that is shown to the tourists in Auschwitz is a fake. Well, I mentioned this in a reader's letter in a German newspaper a week or two later as a historical fact, which should be brought to the attention of the German people who are paying thousands of millions of dollars to the state of Israel ever since the end of World War II for that particular fake. And Dr. Bernd Martin wrote me a letter formally repudiating our friendship, rescinding the right to call each other du, saying that he didn't want to have anything more to do with me. Please would I not write him any more letters. And I wrote him a letter despite that, saying, Dr. Martin, I have the utmost sympathy with you, and I understand the Zwangslage, the position that you are in as a federal German historian. It's quite plain to me. He's terrified of his future. They're all terrified of their future. In a German court only a year and a half ago, I said to the judge who was sentencing me, I said, I've got the utmost sympathy for your position. You're young. He was a judge of about 28 or 30. I said, you're young. In fact, he wore jeans and sneakers under his gown, because I saw him in the canteen afterwards. I said, I have the utmost sympathy for your position. You're young. You have your entire career ahead of you. But I'm old. I've got my career as a historian behind me. I can afford to write the truth. You can't afford to say the truth yet as a judge, because you are worried about your position in the German judicial system. This is the great tragedy now, that around the world our opponents are establishing new laws in order to protect a legend, because the old methods of historical debate are no longer strong enough to shore up the legend. They can't find the evidence in the archives, they can't find the evidence in the museums, they can no longer believe the eyewitnesses, because the more eyewitnesses who come forward to say, I saw it happen with my very own eyes, somehow, it's difficult, isn't it? Somehow the less credible it seems. The more eyewitnesses who come forward to say, I saw the gas chambers, I saw the crematorium smoking. Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize winner, he says that in his memoirs that he could tell by the colour of the smoke coming from the crematorium chimneys in Auschwitz whether they were burning Poles or Jews that day. I don't know how many of you have got a crematorium in your hometown, but you'll find that they don't smoke the chimneys, one colour or the other. And yet the eyewitnesses have been believed until now, and our enemies are so foolish, our traditional enemies, that they believe that if 100 eyewitnesses aren't believed, then they will be more believable, more credible if they produce 500 eyewitnesses. And if 500 don't suffice, then hey, let's produce 5,000 eyewitnesses. And all the time the story is becoming less credible and not more. Because as the years pass, the man in the street says to himself, 50 years later, 1993, surely the archives in London or in Washington or in Canberra or in Moscow, surely the archives should by now produce one single sheet of paper bearing that word gas chamber in German. They don't. Nowhere in all the archives of the world, and I've worked in them for 30 years now, nowhere is there one single sheet of German wartime documentary evidence referring to gas chambers or factories of death or any of these other propaganda words that we British invented so cleverly in 1942. And so they have to protect the legend now with laws. In France, they introduced a new law 2 years ago, on the 14th of July, in fact, the great historical festival in France, Bastille Day. They introduced a new law making it called an amendment to the Press Act, making it a criminal offence in France to challenge the veracity of any of the crimes as defined in the Nuremberg Charter, the charter under which the Nuremberg trials were held in 1945, 1946. So in theory, if I go to France now and say, I don't believe that the Germans killed 15,000 Poles in the Katyn forest, I am committing a criminal offence in France, and my traditional enemies would gleefully see me taken off to be fined or imprisoned or, who knows, even put before the guillotine. But we all know, in the meantime, that although in Nuremberg the Allies held the Germans responsible for the Katyn forest massacres of 1940-41, although we all know that the Germans were held to be guilty of that, in the meantime, a year ago, the Kremlin has finally admitted that the Poles were murdered by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. So that's the truth, but I'm not allowed to go to France to challenge it because they have a law protecting the lie. And it's the same in Germany. In Germany, anybody who goes and stands in public or writes in a reader's letter to a newspaper or in a book and imputes or infers or implies or suggests or mentions that the gas chambers did not exist, in his opinion, he is committing a criminal offence. In Germany, the law doesn't say, you shan't say the gas chambers didn't exist. The law is called defamation of the memory of the dead. And if you want to ask what connection there is between defaming the memory of the dead and saying that these concrete buildings didn't exist in Poland, then you're entitled to ask that question. I don't know the answer for it. All I know is that I myself have been held to be guilty of that particular misdemeanor. I made that statement in a speech, as you will understand, having spoken with Professor Bernd Martin, the head of the history department in Freiburg, who himself told me that he knew from Professor Pieper, the head of the Auschwitz State Museum and Archives, what they showed the tourists was a fake. So in a famous beer hall in Munich, the Löwenbräu, on April the 21st, 1990, I spoke to an audience of 1,000 people and said, in my opinion, the gas chamber they show the tourists in Auschwitz is a dummy produced after the war. In the meantime, we had other evidence to support this, which I'll set out in the later part of this talk. Although this was a private meeting of 1,000 people, I was arrested by the police, held in custody for a few hours, released on bail. A few months later, I received a notification from the German courts that I'd been fined 3,000 Deutschmarks, £1,000, a couple of $1,000 for this particular statement. In the meantime, of course, the Deutschmark's gone up, the pound's gone down. It doesn't matter, because we appealed that particular verdict against me on May the 5th, 1991. I went to Germany and appealed against that particular sentence And the judge, in his infinite wisdom, the judge I mentioned before, the 30-year-old wearing the jeans and the sneakers, he said that because Mr. Irving was proving so stubborn, and because I was refusing to see reason, he was going to increase the fine to 10,000 Deutschmarks, which is now £4,000, or pretty close on 10,000 Australian dollars. $10,000 for expressing an opinion, which happens to be true, of course. You might think this is an injustice, but that wasn't the injustice. The real injustice was that the judge refused to hear any evidence. I invited Dr. František Pieper, the director of the Auschwitz State Museum and Archives, himself to come to Munich and give evidence. He refused to come. Now, why should he refuse to come? I offered to pay him a witness fee. I offered to pay his airfare from Warsaw, or whatever that was the closest Polish city to Auschwitz, the closest airport, to fly to Munich to give evidence for that one day, the 2 days that the trial is going to last. He should come to, and with his hand on a stack of Bibles or Talmuds or whatever other holy scriptures he chose to use, he could say, Irving is a liar, because I am the director of the Auschwitz State Museum and Archives, and I know that the gas chambers existed. And yet he didn't dare to come because he knew he would have been committing perjury. Didn't matter anyway, because the judge announced in advance he wasn't going to allow the appearance of Dr. Pieper as a witness. Nor was he going to hear any of the other evidence that we were producing. I'll talk about it later. The chemical evidence, the forensic evidence. He wasn't going to allow us to produce any documents about Auschwitz. He allowed the introduction of no evidence at all, using one word, offenkundig, which in German means this is an established fact. Gas chambers are an established fact, therefore for all eternity no one is going to be allowed now to challenge whether they existed or not. Now, if I was an average German citizen, and I felt that 2 or 3 generations down the road I was being blamed for something which probably didn't happen, the massacre of millions of people in gas chambers, in factories of death, and we now begin to suspect that the factories of death were just brutal slave labor camps, that the gas chambers are a figment of enemy, in other words, Allied propaganda. If I was a German, I'd be getting pretty steamed up about this. But they can't get steamed up about it, because the law in Germany says that anybody who challenges it is committing an offense. They are defaming the memory of the dead. So we appealed again. By this time I had an army of lawyers working for me, not just ordinary lawyers. Let me mention who they are. The first lawyer who represented me in the appeal was Dr. Hayo Hermann, a colonel of the German Air Force in World War II, who by his single-handed efforts as a fighter pilot in World War II, by the new innovations, the tactical innovations he introduced, probably saved the lives of 500,000 Berlin citizens in the autumn of 1943. A brave man. Now 75 years old, he volunteered to act as a lawyer for me in the German law court so that I would not have to pay any legal fees. Immediately at his side came 2 more lawyers, Dr. Klaus Goebbels, Dr. Karl Schaller, both Austrians. They both had to put up with quite a lot of a fight. In fact, when the appeal came to be heard a day before, one of them wrote me a letter saying that unfortunately he had come under such pressure that he was going to have to withdraw from the case. And I protested to the judge, and I said that I demand this court protects my lawyers from external pressures, because I, as a citizen and as a defendant, am entitled to know that my lawyers are not being intimidated and subjected to pressures with their future livelihoods and careers put at risk. The judge refused to intervene. It's a very lonely fight we're fighting there in the German law courts, and you can see how lonely it was when I mentioned that the outcome of this particular appeal, which was heard on January the 13th this year, 1993, the fine of 10,000 Deutschmarks was arbitrarily increased by the judge to 30,000 Deutschmarks. 30,000 Deutschmarks. You're looking at a fine of £12,500, or in round figures about $25,000 or $30,000. A fine on me as an established historian for expressing an opinion which I sincerely hold on the basis of 30 years' work in the archives, and which none of the historians of Germany or Britain or France or Australia or anywhere around the world is prepared openly to contest. The only way they can contest this opinion is by banning me and my colleagues and people who try to voice the same opinions as myself. But gradually our voice is being heard, and we're making our case in a kind of backhanded way, because journalists who are not noted for their quick-wittedness or insight or perceptivity, journalists are now beginning to scratch themselves and saying, that's a bit funny, isn't it? A 30,000 Deutschmark fine on somebody for expressing an opinion. Germany, a democracy, a free country. What's going on here? Oberon War. who is the son of the noted British novelist Evelyn Waugh. He's now a journalist for the Daily Telegraph. He wrote a column in the Daily Telegraph after I was fined saying, what kind of historical truth is this that needs the protections of fines and prison sentences and deportations in order to exist as a fact? What kind of fact is it if it can't exist just by itself? Historical facts can normally exist by themselves without this kind of armor plate. So by their very actions, our opponents are discrediting themselves. Let me give you another example. I was in Moscow last year in July, finding the Goebbels diaries on microfiche, which I mentioned earlier. From Moscow I flew to Munich, which in itself is now a hazardous task for me because I'm banned from Germany. I still go to Germany. I've been to Germany probably 10, 15 times the last year and a half. But I'm technically banned from going to Germany. The Ministry of the Interior, in a frantic attempt to try and preserve its image, has banned me from going into Germany. The author of The Destruction of Dresden and the Rommel biography and all these other great books about German history. But I flew from Moscow to Munich because the next day I had to go down to Rome to address a meeting in the University of Rome. I'd been invited by a university professor. Our traditional enemies were so frightened about what I might say that when I stepped down the steps of that plane in July last year at Rome's Giampino Airport, at the foot of the steps of the plane I found, I suppose, 10 police cars with flashing blue lights, loaded with carabinieri, all carrying rifles and calling out my name, Mr. Irving, Mr. Irving. And they weren't there just to carry my baggage, it turned out. I was taken straight over to the police station, the airport building, held in the police station. It was rather amusing. Of course, for the purposes of that particular interrogation, I refused to understand Italian. So they had to interrogate me in English, which was more painful than for, I suppose it was painful for each of us. The English they had to speak and the English I had to listen to. And at the end of this interrogation, which consisted of my saying that I was an English citizen and a citizen of the European community and I refused to answer any questions, at the end of the interview, I sat there for a few minutes and then the man who had come to meet me was brought in and I had quite a conversation with him in Italian, at which the Italian police colonel went frantic and he instructed us to be silent. And I thought, this isn't the Third Reich. This isn't even Israel. I can say what I want here. Why not? I said, I'm going to say what I want. I'm going to continue talking to the man. He said, no, silenzio. And I said, where does it say silenzio? There's not even a sign anywhere saying silenzio. He said, I tell you to be silent. And I said, there's no sign saying silent, trying to continue speaking to my friend who came to the airport to pick me up. And this police colonel in this brand new airport building, he was so frantic at the overriding of his authority that he took a felt pen with a half-inch thick nib and on the wall of this brand new airport building he wrote in letters 1 foot high, I tell you where the word silencio is. Watch this, C-I-L-E-N-C-I-O, silencio. So you have moments of humor, moments of comedy in this particular fight. And I was put on a plane that very same afternoon back to Munich. And was I unhappy? And the answer is no. It was another victory. It's another victory over our traditional enemies. They thought they'd silenced me. But no, because what they are admitting, by having me sent straight back out of Italy, so I couldn't speak to that audience in Rome, the traditional enemies are admitting that nowhere in the whole of the Italian country, from one end to the other, from the thigh down to the tip of its toe, did they have one professor or one academic or one historian who was capable of refuting me in a free and open debate. And in every country where they ban me, in every country where they kick me out or deport me or won't let me in, like now Australia, like the end of last year Canada, where our traditional enemies succeed in having me excluded from the country, they are tacitly admitting that here too, in the entire country of Canada, in the entire continent of Australia, they have not one historian who is qualified to challenge me and prove me wrong. And if that isn't a victory, then I don't know what is. So what is the role of honor of this list of countries where my opponents have admitted that they cannot confront me, they can't debate, they've got no one capable of debating not only me but any of the other historians who share my opinions? Well, we're indebted to the Australian Jewish community for listing these countries, as they've repeatedly done in letters to the Australian newspapers and in their articles and in their representations to the Australian government, ever since I made it known in October 1992 that I intended to conduct a tour of Australia. they themselves have listed the countries, saying, Mr. Irving, in fact, I think one of them, Michael Marks, one of the Australian Jewish leaders, said Mr. Irving has convictions in South Africa, Italy, Australia, Austria, Germany, Canada, the United States, virtually around the world, in fact. Convictions, of course, is going a bit too far, as Mr. Michael Marks is going to find out shortly when he receives our first writ, along with the Australian Jewish News, which publish that kind of rubbish. More accurate is to say that Mr. Irving has difficulty in getting into certain countries. These are listed by my traditional enemies as Italy, South Africa, the United States, Canada, Germany, Austria. In each of these countries, it's the same people behind the difficulties. The Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, for example. And this is what rather surprised me about Australia, because when I heard that the Simon Wiesenthal Center had put the pressure on the Australian government, and the Australian government had collapsed within only a few days of this pressure being put on them, I was disappointed, because I thought the Australians are made of tougher meat than that. I thought that if I could put up with that kind of pressure for 2 years, just as an individual, that the Australian people, the Australian government, could tell these people in Los Angeles to go take a running jump if they'd wanted to, or tell their frontmen down in Australia to go take a running jump. But they didn't. And I think it's for the Australian people, the Australian electorate perhaps, in March 1993 to decide whether that's the kind of weak-kneed government that they want, or if they want that kind of government, then they're going to have to ask the government what kind of stranglehold these people have on them that they can allow them to run rings around them and dictate terms to them, who can come and who can go. I haven't got a criminal record. I've been in Australia a couple of times before, and I can't remember having robbed the banks or mugged old ladies or bludgeoned people to death with shillelaghs. So what exactly was it that made me persona non grata in Austria or Australia or Italy or any of these other countries? Well, it's the same gang of liars who are trying to protect a legend. And they do it from country to country in exactly the same way. It began, in fact, in June 1983, 10 years ago, when I was on a speaking tour of Austria. On that occasion, a body known as the Austrian Dokumentationsarchiv des Widerstandes, the archive for documenting resistance, which insisted that the Austrian government turf me out. And the Minister of the Interior in Austria, who was at that time a man called Karl Blecher, which is the Czech word for a flea, in fact, Karl Blecher had me turfed out, driven at very high speed to the frontier, and booted into Germany, for which he then had to pay, because we took legal action against the Austrian government very shortly afterwards, and the Austrian government was ordered to pay me compensation for the illegal deportation. I've yet to see a single shilling of that money. I don't know who took the money. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't our traditional enemies who managed somehow to get the money as well as having had me thrown out. In Austria, then I carried out a speaking tour in November 1989. On that occasion, the speaking tour went well. The police, in fact, themselves endorsed the content of my speech. They said it was unimpeachable. They listened to the recordings. Notwithstanding that, shortly after I left Austria, it was made known to me that an international Interpol arrest warrant had been issued against me, but it's never been executed. I've been to Austria several times since then, most recently on January the 14th this year. The arrest warrant has never been executed, but these are the methods that our opponents are using. It's a strange kind of method to use against a historian, I would have thought. Why don't they just say, Mr. Irving, here's a document that proves you're a liar. Here's the document from the archives that proves you're talking through your hat. They can't do that, and so they use the systems where they're familiar. They use the corruption, they use the intimidation, they use all the mechanisms of the law that they've been accustomed to using for the last 40 or 50 years in order to preserve their position. In Germany, as I described earlier, they now have a special law to protect the gas chamber legend and certain other lies of history. In France, they have the special law to amending the Press Act, which makes it a criminal offense to challenge the truth of any of the Nuremberg crimes. When I went to Canada in October last year to conduct a speaking tour right the way across Canada, where I've been every year for the last 5 or 6 years, speaking in big cities and small, from Vancouver on the Pacific coast right the way across to Ottawa and Montreal. As soon as our traditional enemies knew I was going to be speaking in Canada yet again, they pleaded with the Canadian government in Ottawa not to let me in. And once again, it's a mystery, isn't it? The influence that these people have. The mighty Canadian government wrote back a letter to these people in Los Angeles saying that yes, 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 they would keep Mr. Irving out. And on October the 9th, when I was in Los Angeles speaking to an audience there, I received by Federal Express a letter from the Canadian government saying they weren't going to let me in if I came, because I was deemed to fall into one of two categories of inadmissible people, namely people who were likely to commit a criminal offense if they did enter Canada, or people who had already committed a criminal offense, which was a criminal offense under Canadian law as well. The criminal offense in question, well, the criminal offense that I've been convicted of in Germany, because the German judge, the one in jeans and sneakers, had found me guilty of having libeled the memory of the dead. This trumped up charge in Germany, this technically made me a convicted felon. Never matter the fact, never mind that we had appealed that charge in Germany. And under the United Nations Charter, no conviction is deemed to be a conviction until the last remedies of appeal have been exhausted. So I'm not a convicted person at all. This didn't matter, and that's what we would have said straight away in Canada. And as for being likely to commit a criminal offense in Canada, well, having been in Canada for 30 or 40 years, I was unlikely to start committing criminal offenses now. So I went into Canada, the passport official duly stamped my passport, and I began the speaking tour in Victoria and British Columbia on October the 28th last year. I made the speech, and at the end of the speech, no fewer than 8 Royal Canadian Mounted Policemen stormed into the hall and arrested me and took me off in handcuffs. The speech, ironically, was on the subject of the freedom of speech. I'd just been awarded the George Orwell Freedom of Speech Medal by the local Society for Freedom of Speech. And within minutes of having been awarded this very impressive plaque, I was being arrested by 8 Canadian Mounted Police and taken off in handcuffs to the local police station, where an extraordinary 3-week battle began right the way across Canada, which showed once again how badly our traditional enemies had miscalculated, because they had hoped, of course, that I would just be thrown out of Canada, over the border into Washington State perhaps, and there'd be just 2 lines, if that, in the local edition of the Vancouver Sun. Instead of which, there were 25 television teams present. As the case grew in importance, the judge had to provide a special media room to hold all the journalists who'd come from right the way across the continent, right the way across Canada, closed circuit television. It occupied the front pages of the newspapers and the television stations for 3 weeks. Boy, did our enemies miscalculate on that occasion. The head of the local Jewish organization, a rather unappetizing man called Marvin Kurtz, was seen on television screaming, "I want that guy out of Canada." Well, okay, they want me out of Canada, they want me out of the United States, they want me out of Germany, they want me out of Italy, they want me out of all these countries. But the fact remains, they can't refute what I'm saying. They can't refute what the evidence of the archives is. And the evidence of the archives is what I'm going to come to now. Where did the Holocaust legend come from? You know, I don't say the Holocaust lie, because to say that it's a lie implies, first of all, you don't believe any of it, and parts of it have to be believed. To say it's a lie also implies that it's a malicious lie, that people know it's a lie, and they've been spreading it knowingly as a lie for the last 50 years. I call it a Holocaust legend because then it has something like the quality of a religion almost. You believe things because you've been told it by people who seem reliable. You believe it because you've been told it by people who in turn have been told it by people. It's a long chain of gullible people who over the last 50 years have been told it and have believed it because they had no reason not to believe it. And this is why the Holocaust legend has survived until now, because nobody has come forward really with any kind of credibility and has rattled at the foundations of that legend and said, okay, prove it. Explain to me, for example, how it's possible to gas millions of people in gas chambers and yet leave no significant residue of the poison gas used, hydrogen cyanide, in the fabric of that gas chamber. And our opponents say, hey, 50 years later you don't expect to find residues of a gas in a gas chamber. The answer is you do. And any chemist worth his salt, excuse the pun, any chemist worth his salt will confirm it. In a gas chamber which has been exposed to hydrogen cyanide gas over the years, over 40 or 50 years, you're still going to find residues of that totally permanent compound ferric ferrocyanide, which is otherwise known as Prussian blue. In fact, it's so permanent a stuff that it's a dye stuff. It's the blue dye stuff known as Prussian blue. So you've got this substance which should be in the walls of the gas chambers, even now 50 years later, and yet it's not there. Although allegedly millions of people have been gassed in these buildings using hydrogen cyanide. And we can prove it should be there because just a few hundred yards away in the Auschwitz complex is a little gas chamber, which looks like a gas chamber. This one's got gas-tight doors and a peephole and rails for little railings for carrying in the racks full of clothing because it was used for fumigating clothing, the prisoners' clothing. And the walls of that little gas chamber in Auschwitz are so soaked with ferric ferrocyanide that on the outside of the gas chamber walls you can see the blue stain seeping through. And colleagues of mine back in February 1988 took samples from that gas chamber illegally. They hammered and chiseled away samples of the brickwork from that, and samples from brickwork of the other gas chambers where allegedly millions of people were gassed, and they took them illegally back to the United States, and these 40 samples from the little gas chamber here, the fumigation one, and the big lethal one, allegedly, samples were taken back to the United States and tested by qualified American forensic laboratories for the concentration of cyanide still found in them. And in this little one, which was used for fumigating clothing, they found no fewer than 141 milligrams of cyanide residue per 1 kilogram of brickwork. A colossal concentration. You can actually see the blue stain on the wall still. And yet in the buildings where they had allegedly murdered millions of people with cyanide gas, there's not the slightest significant trace of cyanide residue. And this fact, which was told to me in April 1988, when I attended a court case in Toronto as a qualified expert witness, as a historian, when I saw those forensic reports, that's what tilted me into becoming a hardcore disbeliever in the Holocaust. I don't believe in the gas chambers now because, having at university studied analytical chemistry, quantitative and qualitative analysis, I know that unlike writing history, chemical analysis is an exact science. You see, when you're a historian, if you don't find what you want in the documents, you can read between the lines. And in between the lines, you find the evidence you don't find in the actual documents. Historians have been doing that now for 50 years. But in the laboratories, they can work to 6 or 10 or 15 decimal points now. They use gas chromatography, they use all the modern methods of spectroscopic analysis, they can use any kind of analytical techniques to establish precisely what chemical compounds are still present in the fabric of those buildings. This report, which was published in 1988, is the Leuchter Report, and it has caused consternation around the world. Fred Leuchter was actually the American, whether he was an engineer or a gardener or a soothsayer or a caricaturist is unimportant. He was the American who went to Auschwitz in February 1988 with a couple of colleagues, and they took the actual samples. They took the samples back to the United States and had them analyzed by qualified laboratories. I published the Leuchter Report in England. I published it myself. In June 1989, we did a very good edition of it in England, and I wrote the introduction to it, in which I said that it was flawed. There were loopholes, of course. I would have liked personally to have seen those 40 samples that Leuchter took notarized, each one notarized by a lawyer. I mean, you want to be sure beyond any peradventure that the samples did come from the gas chambers and not from a BP petrol station on the road on the way to Auschwitz, for example. Just for example. And at the press conference that I held in England, not without difficulty, to launch the Leuchter Report, I mentioned the difficulties there because already our traditional enemies were panicking. They put pressure on the hall where the press conference is going to be held to cancel the contract. So I held the press conference in the drawing room of my own home in Mayfair in London, with the result that the journalists arriving at the press conference found that there were 500 members of the Jewish community outside the building blocking the way to the front door so that they couldn't attend the press conference. They were as frightened as that. And when the journalists, some of whom were quite tough, insisted on attending the press conference, they were required first of all to identify themselves with their press passes. And when they got back to their editorial newsrooms, they found that the editors had received telephone calls from certain members of the Jewish community requesting them not to publicize the Leuchter Report. All of this satisfies me that we must be on the right track, as indeed did the dialogue that took place at the press conference, because a couple of the Jewish newspapers who were present then said, "Mr. Irving, how do we know that Fred Leuchter wasn't a trickster and that you're not a gullible fool, that Fred Leuchter didn't take the sample somewhere totally different, and that you're a gullible fool to have fallen for him. And I said, you're absolutely right. But then it is for you, surely, to prove that we have been taken in by replicating the tests. You now go to Auschwitz, take 40 samples and submit them yourself. You can have the lawyers present. You can have them submitted to another laboratory and prove that there are massive quantities of cyanide in those buildings. Well, they didn't comment on that. In fact, they didn't even quote that in their report on the press conference. But believe it or not, František Pieper, the director of the Auschwitz State Archives, 2 years later, he did precisely that. In all secrecy and under cover of darkness, with lawyers present, he carried out a replica of the Leuchter tests. He took 20 samples from the fumigation chamber and from the alleged lethal gas chambers in Auschwitz. And to his great embarrassment, when the results came back from the State Forensic Laboratory in Krakow, it was exactly the same as Leuchter and his laboratory had found out 2 years before. Did the Auschwitz State Museum and Archives publish their own report, the same as we had? No. They put it in their safe, they rubber-stamped it, they put it in their safe, and they hoped it would go away. But it didn't go away. In fact, somebody in those archives supplied a copy of it to us. That's how we know those tests were carried out. Another crucial piece of evidence that we're right and that they are lying. But that's not the only evidence that the gas chambers didn't exist. I think probably the most significant piece of evidence is what we British ourselves did. In the war, we actually broke the code of the SS. And we began reading in 1942 the coded top-secret messages of the commandant of Auschwitz reporting back to Berlin, Rudolf Höss. Not Rudolf Hess, Rudolf Höss. Rudolf Höss reported back to Berlin day by day. Well, what his actual daily reports contained were batches of figures. But the official British historian, Professor Sir Frank Hinsley, who wrote the British official history of the British intelligence in World War II, he published an appendix in volume 2 based just on these Auschwitz intercepts. And Hinsley came to the conclusion that these figures that the Höss reports contained were without doubt the following 4 figures. Firstly, the number of prisoners who had arrived in Auschwitz in the previous 24 hours. Secondly, the number of prisoners who had left in the previous 24 hours. Thirdly, the number of prisoners on hand in Auschwitz, and it's a big camp, about 200,000 people. And the 4th figure was fatalities, how many people died in the previous 24 hours. This 4th figure was broken down into 3 subcategories. And Hinsley said it wasn't too difficult to work out that the first figure was the number who had died from epidemics and disease. The second figure, a vastly small figure, an infinitesimally smaller figure, was the number of prisoners who had been shot, and the third figure was the number of prisoners who had been hanged, which was of the same order of magnitude. Nearly all the deaths in Auschwitz, said Hinsley, were from epidemics and disease. And I quote Hinsley verbatim, he said, "There is no reference in the intercepts to any gassing." Remember, these are the top secret signals written in the top secret code of the SS. So there can be no question of Höss writing something for the benefit of historians after the war. Now, I've not seen our traditional opponents, Jeremy Jones or Michael Marks or any of the other Australian Jews who have opposed my coming into the country, explaining those coded intercepts away. And yet they have to be explained. If you're a historian, you can't just accept the evidence you like and use that and drop the other, push it under the carpet and pretend it doesn't exist. Somehow now our opponents have to explain to me as an intelligent person how you can gas millions of people without leaving any cyanide residue in the walls. Somehow you've got to explain to me as an intelligent historian why Rudolf Höss was gassing millions of people in Auschwitz and yet not mentioning this fact in his daily reports back to Berlin. Something funny is going on. And there's more evidence than this, and if I ever come to Australia and have a chance to speak in public to audiences there, I will go into all the other detailed evidence. But it's only fair that I should mention the evidence against these, the likelihood that these gas chambers didn't exist. The evidence is pretty weak, but it needs to be mentioned. First of all, how do you explain the eyewitnesses? Hundreds of eyewitnesses, thousands of eyewitnesses now. In every newspaper you see them parading their tattoo marks. Secondly, what happened to the Jews then? They can all say, I had a friend whose entire family vanished in World War II. And thirdly, if the gas chambers didn't exist, then where did the legend come from? How do you explain where it comes from? These are three important questions that we have to face now. Of these three questions, the question about the eyewitnesses is the most sensitive, because it's difficult to answer it without offending. But I think that it's important that you have to answer it because it's the one that first springs to mind. Everyone has seen an eyewitness. They're there in the newspapers, they're there on television, they're usually very voluble, their stories are streamlined. They know what a gas chamber looked like, they've seen the crematoria, their stories are heart-rending, they've suffered a trauma, there's no doubt at all. They were put in concentration camps as innocent people. They were Jews, they were brutally manhandled, they were separated from their families, who in many cases they never saw again. And you don't really like questioning the veracity of their memories. And yet as a historian, you have to, just as if you were a policeman or a judge. Any judge will say, given a choice between forensic evidence and an eyewitness, he will prefer the forensic evidence every time. So will a policeman, so should in fact a journalist. And it shouldn't be any different just because we're dealing with Holocaust survivors in the Jewish community. They have no special right to be believed. What is the phenomenon that's at work here? Now, I've said that the eyewitnesses are in fact a matter for psychological examination, I think, psychiatric examination even, and it was that sentence that earned me the arrest warrant in Austria, apparently, because it is such a sensitive issue. But I don't mean that in an offensive way. I wouldn't mind it if somebody said about me that some of my statements need to be psychiatrically analyzed, because the human being, the psyche, is a very complex instrument. It's not like a piece of electronics that you can analyze with a cathode ray tube. The human being is motivated by all sorts of swirling, contradicting confluences of cross-currents and eddies and emotions. And so it is with human beings who came in and out of World War II. They have been at the center or near the center of a traumatic experience. And this traumatic experience goes larger, it bulks larger in their memory as time recedes. Human pride demands that these people must have been at the center of the traumatic experience that has formed such a large part of their own personal history. So if a Mrs. Altmann can point to a tattoo on her arm and say, I was in Auschwitz, then I am deeply sorry for her, because there's no doubt at all that Auschwitz was a brutal slave labor camp. But Mrs. Altmann has probably been questioned by her friends and neighbors and relatives for the last 50 years about Auschwitz. And she can't very well describe her everyday life as centering around the peeling of potatoes or some other menial task. She knows that the people who are questioning her about Auschwitz want to hear about the crematoria and the gas chambers, and after a time she describes the crematoria and the gas chambers, because human pride demands that she not have been in one of the other barracks perhaps 5 miles away from the crematorium, but right next door to it. It's a matter of human pride, and we can't really begrudge these people for placing themselves and their recollections so close to the event, so close to the heart of the particular trauma. They're not dissimulating, they're not being consciously mendacious. We all suffer from this problem, that as time goes on, we no longer remember events, we remember memories of events. We remember things no longer in a stereoscopic fashion, but in a monochrome, plain, flat series of flashes, of still images. And if you once asked somebody what was it like around the edge of the picture, what was going on behind it, or something else, then your mind is blank. Your memory can no longer help, because you're no longer remembering the event. You're only remembering this series of pictures and images. And into this series of flashes of still life images are, of course, undeniably interposed and interpolated over the ensuing 50 years, not just the product and images generated by her own memory, the memory of the eyewitness, but also images that have come from other sources, from television, from books, from newspapers, from reading about trials of Adolf Eichmann, from films like War and Remembrance with Richard Robert Mitchum and the rest of it. Until by now, in the 1990s, there's not an Auschwitz survivor who doesn't know what a gas chamber looked like, because they've seen the images in the media. And so at the beginning of the episode, at the beginning of history, of this particular tragedy, back in 1945, when the eyewitnesses, so-called, in question, they were at that time very few in number, their eyewitness descriptions of the gas chambers and the gassing procedure all wildly contradict each other in a manner which would be totally impossible if they were actually describing something that they had seen only a few weeks earlier. By now, in the 1990s, the images are streamlined. The man went up on the roof, he opened this hole in the roof, there were 6 of these holes, and the man tipped in the canister of the Cyclone B capsules, and the screams down below lasted only a few minutes, and then the Jewish commandos had to go in and bring the bodies out. Somehow, of course, these Jewish squads were no longer affected by the cyanide fumes. They were in some way miraculously protected from them. The fumes were blue, the bodies were red, and so on. All the pictures are the same. None of them stand up to any kind of historical analysis or indeed forensic analysis, but the streamlining is there because although the people try very hard to remember what actually happened and what they saw, they're no longer recalling experiences of their own memory. The eyewitness survivor testimony is very shaky. It's far too shaky on which to base the condemnation of an entire nation, namely the German nation, in my view, and I think probably any sober and independent judge would probably back me up on that. The very existence of so many eyewitnesses, of course, begs the existence of an extermination program, as I had to say rather tastelessly to people like the Mrs. Alton that I mentioned before. I say, isn't it rather extraordinary that there are so many thousands of you survivors? And she said, what do you mean? I said, how many survivors, how many eyewitnesses are there? And she said, tens of thousands of people saw the gas chambers. And I say, tens of thousands of Jews survived Auschwitz, which we are told was an extermination camp where the Nazis were killing every Jew they could get their hands on. Isn't there something a bit paradoxical there? I mean, are you trying to tell us that the Nazis were sloppy in some way? Sloppy Nazis? It just doesn't go, does it? How did so many Jews survive? The answer is, of course, there was an enormous death rate in Auschwitz from epidemics. Probably 100,000 Jews died in Auschwitz, but not from gas chambers. They died from epidemics. And in fact, the Russians in September 1990 released to the West German government the death books of Auschwitz. They didn't release all the death books because they hadn't got them any longer. They released 46 death books containing the names of 74,000 dead people. We've now seen some of those death certificates that are contained in the death books, and the ages range from about 10 years old to nearly 90, 95. The whole spectrum of human life is there dying in Auschwitz from every conceivable cause, just as you'll find it in any large town. And Auschwitz, after all, was a town of a couple of 100,000 people. And these death books have now been turned over by the Russians back to the West German government. And that figure of 100,000 people, if you look at it, is about what you would expect from the number of crematoria they had in Auschwitz, the handling capacity of the crematoria. It's about what you would expect. It also tallies, incidentally, with the death rate, which we can calculate from the intercepts that we British were decoding. It all appears to mesh. And I don't deny it. The death of 100,000 innocent people in a slave labor camp like Auschwitz is a crime. 100,000 people dying, innocent people dying in 3 years. Even if we say that of those 100,000 people who died, a fraction were murdered, hanged or shot. Suppose we say a quarter were murdered. 25,000 people murdered in Auschwitz in the 3 years. If we take that generous figure, then I would say 25,000 people murdered in Auschwitz in 3 years is still half the number of people that we murdered in Hamburg, burning them alive in one night in 1943. We're looking at crime and crime. They're both crimes. One crime gets all the publicity. One crime is the only one that's referred to in the media today, and the other crime, you put up a statue to commemorate the man who carried it out. There's something wrong about that. Now the second question is, if the gas chambers didn't exist, where did they come from? Well, had I come to Australia, I would have produced and shown to you, in the manner as they say in the law courts, the documents from the British archives showing how we in Britain, having first heard rumours that the Nazis were killing Jews in gas chambers, rumours that the Jews themselves had told us, Gerhard Riechner, a man who was still alive, in the autumn of 1942, we decided to use that fact, which we knew was totally untrue, in our wartime propaganda. We turned the fact over to the British Political Warfare Executive, the PWE, and from that moment on, as I could prove, producing the radio monitoring reports, the BBC and our Psychological warfare organizations, the aerial leaflet organizations, made increasing use of this particular legend about the gas chambers, killing millions of Jews in Nazi concentration camps. That, I think, is a plausible explanation where the legend first came from. And after a year, of course, we're hearing the echo of our own propaganda. There's hardly a German who hasn't been listening clandestinely to the BBC who hasn't heard talk about the gas chambers. And they begin mentioning it in rumours to each other. From one washerwoman to the next, the rumour goes around Germany until finally they've actually seen about it, and their son's working in a unit, and he's heard about it too. And that's how the legend gains credibility from the German side too. So this explains, in my view, where the story came from. And the third and final question is, what happened to the Jews then? Everybody has met a Jew who says, or you've seen about it in the newspaper, who says his entire family vanished in World War II. Well, it has to be said that World War II was a bloody and a brutal war, a barbarous war, in which entire cities were set on fire. Many Germans can say entire families vanished in World War II and they don't know what happened to their families to the next of kin. Many concentration camps, as the Russians approached, were evacuated and set out on a long cold march through the European winter of December 1944, January 1945 to the west. The concentration camp inmates arrived in Berlin or in Leipzig or in Dresden just in time for the RAF bombers to set fire to their cities. In Dresden, 1.5 million people camping out in the streets on the night of February the 13th, 1945. Nobody knows who they were, refugees, concentration camp prisoners, citizens of Dresden itself. After the bombers retired, 45 minutes later, another wave came, and then at noon on February the 14th, the American Air Force joined in. Over 130,000 people died in that particular air raid. The same kind of raids took place on Leipzig, Berlin, Cottbus, refugee centers up and down the center of Germany. Nobody knows how many Jews died in those air raids. Nobody knows how many Jews died on the roads of hunger or starvation or just sheer cold. Nobody knows how many Jews then survived World War II in the displaced persons camps. And this is one of the most interesting aspects. It's possible to research it, I suppose, but to my knowledge, none of the Holocaust historians have done so. The National Archives in Washington houses a report this thick of the Office of Strategic Services, the American Secret Service, in which are investigated the activities of the Hagana, the Jewish Zionist underground organization, in those very displaced persons camps in the first months after World War II. The Hagana went from DP camp to camp, scouring them for all the Jews they could find who were still living in these camps, these wretched people, loading them onto trucks and shipping them then with United Nations funds and resources all the way across Europe, through the Middle East to Palestine. So Mr. Goldman, who is found in a camp somewhere in Bavaria, is put aboard a truck with his family and shipped across to the Middle East to Palestine, where he is given a new life and a new identity, an Israeli identity with a Hebrew name. Mr. Goldman has vanished, and the Hebrew gentleman in the Middle East then starts drawing compensation because Mr. Goldman has vanished. This is the irony which a lot of Germans are now beginning to worry about. And it's been going on now for 50 years, and you begin to suspect why the West German government, for all these years, has made it a criminal offense even to challenge and to question what has been going on. As the chief rabbi of Britain, Lord Jakobowitz, said, it became big business. And it did no credit to the Jews as a whole, because I know thousands of Jews. My publisher was a Jew. My lawyer was a Jew. They are all perfectly ordinary, decent, respectable people when you know them. And those who you speak to thoroughly abhor what has been going on. They thoroughly abhor the kind of intimidation that's gone on in the last year or two in this frantic final Endkampf by the organized Jewish community, the self-appointed leaders of the organized Jewish community, to try and protect the last tattered remnants of the Holocaust legend. The Holocaust legend is fizzling out. I said 2 years ago that it probably only had 2 years left to survive. Probably I was wrong. Probably it's got about another 6 months even now. But then it's finally dead. Worldwide it has played out. And what we have seen in Canada and in Australia and in America, Italy, Austria, all around the world where they're using these extraordinary, desperate tactics to try and protect, to bolster, to shore up this legend. What we have seen is just one more piece of proof and evidence that it is just a legend, because the truth needs no such bodyguard of lies. The truth is capable of surviving by itself. True history has survived down the years, down the centuries, down the millennia, without fines and deportations and prison sentences. And this is what the Holocaust legend has established. To me, it is unimportant. I'm not Jewish, I'm not anti-Jewish. People say to me, Mr. Irving, television viewers, they say, are you an anti-Semite? Well, in England, my answer to that is, if you promise not to use the word anti-Semite, I promise not to use the word pension funds. You Australians don't understand that because you didn't suffer from a Robert Maxwell. I'm not an anti-Semite. I think it's an impertinence that they ask me that question after what I've had to put up with for the last 30 years of being subjected to terrorism, to being raided by people disguised as telephone engineers, to being attacked in the street, to having pressure put on my publishers to cancel the publication of my books, to being smeared and vilified in a way that the average Australian newspaper reader has only seen a fragment of in the last few weeks of February 1993. This has gone on. It's been organized and directed at me by the international organized Jewish community, and yet I'm not an anti-Semite. Yet. But if I ever become an anti-Semite, it will be their fault. And if the Australian public has become more anti-Semitic as a result of what they've seen over the last few days, this kind of publicity campaign that was generated against me, then once again it'll be not my fault, but it'll be the fault of Mr. Jeremy Jones, Mr. Michael Marks, Walt Secord, and all the other, the Rubensteins, and all the other commentators and letter writers and authors and journalists and politicians and people who tried to put pressure on the fair Australian government to suppress freedom of speech. And freedom of speech isn't just some kind of airy-fairy notion or ideal, which doesn't really deserve to exist at the end of the 20th century. Freedom of speech is like one of those ancient medieval rights, like a right of way, like a right of passage across a farmer's field. You know, the important thing about these ancient medieval rights, under English law anyway, and I'm sure Australian law and the law around the Commonwealth is based on English law in this respect, these ancient rights like freedom of speech need to be asserted. And that is what this is really about. If I put up this fight around the world for freedom of speech, it's not because I'm particularly interested in the Holocaust or Winston Churchill or Pearl Harbor or any of these other great historical episodes. It's because I am interested in basic freedoms. And freedom of speech, like any other ancient right, is a right that needs to be constantly asserted, like a right of way across the countryside. Once a year, somebody has to walk that path, otherwise that right will fall into abeyance. And that is what I try to do. Around the world, I walk that path, the path that's called freedom of speech. Because if you don't walk it, then it falls into abeyance, and ugly forces then come into the fore. And they are the ones who dictate and lay down and ordain and restrict. And we see then a society emerge that is the kind of society which all these liberal politicians proclaim they were trying to prevent in the World War I and the World War II, that saw the sacrifice of so many millions of lives of innocent people. Freedom of speech to me is more important than my own reputation. It's more important to me than any kind of personal financial gain. Freedom of speech is an ideal for which it's worth laying down one's life for.